South Africa, like many countries around the world, is experiencing a femicide epidemic. Despite the high-profile media coverage of some of these stories, many remain untold. The Bhekisisa Centre for Health Journalism, Media Hack and the Canon Collins Trust have teamed up to tell these women's stories. Bhekisisa journalist Joan van Dkyk joins me now. A very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Now, talk to us about the hashtag SayHerName initiative and what sparked it.
Yeah, so this is a project that, as you said, we were doing with Media Hack and the Canon Collins Trust. We've just finished it. We basically started it to try and figure out what actually happens to the people that are killed in this epidemic of femicide. So the project tried to track who's actually made it into the media, and we found, interestingly, that it was a very, very small percentage of the number of femicides that happened in South Africa. Only 4% we could actually found had been reported on in the media, and that 4% has a few strings attached. We only looked at online outlets, we only looked at English language outlets and those that are accessible, not behind a paywall. So it's possible that some of them were missed, but it aligns with previous research on this topic that the media really only paints a partial picture of the femicide happening in the country. Newspapers obviously can't report on every single murder that happens in the country, but I think we could be critical of those that make it into the papers because it very much shapes how people think about these kind of crimes, especially since SAPS doesn't offer us a lot of detailed breakdowns of crime. Newspapers are very much one of the few places of public record where people can learn a little bit about this this kind of crime in the country. And it may skew who people think is most at risk and who is the biggest threat to you. The bottom line is, from our research and from statistics in general, is that as a South African woman, your biggest threat is likely going to be an intimate partner.
And in terms of some of the research that you've been able to gather, why is it that some of these femicide cases actually still go unreported in large numbers?
I think that's got to do you mean in the media specifically?
Sorry, I missed that.
Do you mean in the media specifically or in general?
I mean, in general, when it comes to people actually reporting their cases to the police officers, to the authorities that can actually help them get justice from their perpetrators. Because police can only report on statistics that are related to the cases that come forward to them from victims or victims' families.
Exactly, yes. And so the difficult aspect there is what actually counts as a femicide. The UN, for example, sees gender-based violence as a spectrum, and femicide would be at the very extreme end of that because they argue that, a killing by an intimate partner doesn't just happen out of the blue, it happens as part of this whole process. But in South Africa, SAPS doesn't actually give us a breakdown of relationship or gender between the victim and the perpetrator. There's a tiny little bit of data coming through now. In 2019, we only knew about every fifth murder. We only knew the relationship for every fifth murder. And when we did know the relationship, it was likely to be a boyfriend or a girlfriend or an ex. And in 2020, we have a little bit clearer data because SAPS started doing quarterly breakdowns. And in the second quarter, for example, we knew more than 50% of the gender-based violence murders. The perpetrator was a husband or a boyfriend. So the actual reporting tool, how we actually decide what counts as a femicide, is kind of debated, and it makes it difficult to find a real picture of this.
And when it comes to this initiative, this hashtag SayHerName initiative, how important do you think it is to name the victims of the femicide and put a face to those names more than we actually name perpetrators of the crimes?
Yes, that's what we were hoping, is to we did this project as a kind of a tribute to those people who are named, the awful stories that we do read about, and we hear about these people in waves. We have these big profile things, but this is something that is ongoing, and we just thought it might be a nice way for us to get a collection of this data together, so people, especially, it could be useful for journalists to go back to those older stories and see what has happened to the families. We're very much hoping that this project becomes kind of just a data point for us to go back to and to memorialize in a way the people that we have documented, but also those whose stories we'll never know.
And how many stories have you been able to document or bring to the fore that weren't previously in the media space?
Unfortunately, that's something that we would have taken. It's something that was totally out of our scope to be able to do that. It's about the exact number of stories is. I'll quickly have to look it up. But as I say, we didn't look at stories that weren't already in the media. So there were only, and also only in English language outlets. But it's about in between the 1,000 and 2,000 range of women. And adult women, importantly. These are because SAPS also only records from 18 years and up, so it wouldn't have included children either.
Are you considering actually broadening the scope and including some of the publications that aren't the English ones?
At this point, I don't think our that's beyond the scope of this project at this point. But yeah, definitely something that could be taken further in a different form as well.
And in terms of femicide, what would you say the signs are that people should be looking out for that could sort of be red flags to, whether a sister, a mother or a colleague could be in an abusive relationship?
Oh, that's a very, that is a very difficult question. It's not something that I feel totally able to answer. I think that would more be a question for someone who works with survivors. But there are some ways that you can support people in government hotlines and those kinds of things. The one thing that the government has tried to do recently is to allocate these GBV hotspots around the country where they're going to try and give a little bit more resources to certain police stations. But there have been some questions again about the data on which these hotspots were based. They're based on a combination of statistics, but they don't actually take into consideration the breakdown of population in that province. So most of the hotspots are in the most populous provinces, and Limpopo, the Northern Cape and Mpumalanga don't have any hotspots at all. So we're seeing that even the support for people is kind of not happening in a fair way from the government because our data kind of isn't quite up to scratch.
And do you think that going forward perhaps people could actually create applications, cell phone-based apps perhaps, that could help to collate some of the data from government organizations, from the police regarding areas that are considered hotspots, and maybe even provide information as to what a person can do if they're trying to escape an abusive relationship, or how one can help somebody else who they suspect is in a relationship that is abusive?
So there is an attempt to fix this data problem, definitely. We have the National Strategic Plan on GBV, and we're still waiting on that council, the GBV National Council, to be chosen and to be elected. But some of the teams have already started to try and set up the databases so that NGOs and government projects that are working can share information so we can get a clearer picture of the problem in order to find the better solution. So those things are already in the works on a policy level, but it's been a little bit slow. We still don't have the committees that are going to be running that at this point. But there are quite a few organizations that can help. There's also the Department of Social Development's GBV Command Center. They've also upscaled a little bit in COVID, a hotline that people can call. I don't actually have the number in front of me now, but there are some government resources to use.
And just in closing, what do you feel would be the importance of more online news platforms actually reporting on these cases, in addition to the publications that you say already cover femicide cases quite extensively?
I think it's absolutely important to report on these cases because it's something that as a woman walking around in South Africa you're so aware of. But it's about the important thing for media, I think, is choosing which stories we find important, and not just going for the stories that play into people's fears about each other and about strangers, and to give like a real good overview of who is actually your biggest threat and who is most at risk. And it's an uncomfortable truth that it's going to be the people closest to you. But very often from other research, we see that the media paints this picture of your biggest threat is a stranger or an intruder. But it's actually far worse than that. It's someone very close to you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We'll leave it there. That is Bhekisisa journalist Joan van Dkyk.